Laurie Weiss is joining me from Denver, Colorado, where she's a coach and trainer. She's a master practitioner and a trainer in logosynthesis, and she's also a trainer in transactional analysis. She is the author of 2 books on logosynthesis, and she has a 7-book series called The Secret of Happy Relationships. So thank you for joining me, Laurie.
Oh, it's a delight to be here.
Great. So I always like to start by asking people how they were introduced to logosynthesis and what made them decide to start training in the model. So can you tell us a little about your story?
Well, the first time I was introduced to logosynthesis, I dismissed it completely. It was presented in a lecture format at a seminar, and I went, oh, well, that's another weird thing. I don't get it.
And there's a lot of things out there to kind of capture your attention, right?
Lots of weird things. and then I had with Nancy Porter Steele and Curtis Steele are very old friends, and they're TA friends. And so we were at a conference in Montreal. And since I live in Denver, I get Mexican food whenever I want it, but they don't. And there was a Mexican restaurant in Montreal, and I wasn't interested particularly, but I did want to be with them. So, okay, we'll go to it's going to be quiet. They've got really good food and we can talk. Wonderful. So we get there and it's quiet and we order. And then the families start coming in and the noise level goes up. And then the mariachis start.
And there's a real joy de vivre in Montreal. So right. Yeah, it escalates.
And I'm a ultra sensitive type person. It was like, and then the food comes and I can't eat spicy food. So I always order it mild, oh, this is okay. You can eat this. No. And as soon as I start to eat something that doesn't work for me, I cough. My body just says no. I listen. And that happened 3 times. I didn't get to eat because everything they brought me was inedible to me. So everybody else ate. The noise is going on. And by the time we're all done, it's like, I am ready to leave this place. You can pay the bill. I'll wait outside and I'll calm down. So I did. I did my tapping. I did my deep breathing, and I thought I had calmed down just fine. And then Curtis came out and said, how are you doing? And I said, I'm okay. And what happened? Well, it didn't, I got tense. Well, what really happened? And I said, well, at a certain point, my body just clenched and I went, and he said, oh, okay. Would you try something with me? Would you say some words? And since I'd known Curtis at that point for about 35 years, it was like, sure, okay. And so I did. And then I experienced this profound relaxation afterwards. And it was like, oh, is this what you were talking about before? Uh-huh. Okay, how do I learn? I just had to. I was just fascinated. And it was all pretty new at that point. And they were very anxious to get us on board. So they set up a basic seminar in Halifax on the only weekend we had free to travel in the fall. And so we had to go.
And it's become an annual event, I hear.
Well, a lot, pretty often. And then I hated, at that point, I hated flying. It was overstimulating. It was just too much and it would exhaust me. And nobody really knew how to teach a basic at that point. Willem wasn't there. It was just, we'll do this. And they were just beginning to learn and things like that. I had no idea what I was doing, and I don't think anybody else did either. So I did something. And on the way home, I forgot to be upset on the airplane. So I'm hooked. I was hooked. And I guess I wanted to learn more. And so we set up training with Nancy was my trainer, I think, and Curtis was, maybe she was both. Anyway, we did it long distance. That hadn't been done. Long distance in paper. And we started going back to Halifax. And I went because it was fun. And people kept handing me these pieces of paper that said, oh, you're certified in this or you're certified in that. It's like, okay.
Yeah, and so you're a practitioner, master practitioner, and trainer in logosynthesis, but you also decided to write 2 books on the topic. Can you tell us a little bit about these 2 books and who they're designed to help?
Well, when I started to write, I mean, I've written for 30 years. And what I've written, my focus has always been to take complicated material and make it available for the general public. Because I was trained basically radical psychiatry in the 70s. And it was like, we don't have to do it in the therapist's office. It's not necessary. People can do a lot by themselves. And I was hooked. I even found writings that I did in the 70s that were pretty impressive. They were published then, but a long time ago.
Awesome.
So Willem's books were quite academic at that time and not very easily accessible for the general public. And I made it known, and we sort of went around for a while. And then he said, why don't you write something for the general public? And so I did. And that was the beginning. And so that was the Letting It Go book. That was the first thing on logosynthesis for the general public. Willem has started writing in a more accessible way. So he has a lot of books now too, but this was the first. And the second book came from Willem's invitation to trainers to sit in on some of his workshops. And I said, I would like to sit in on the money one because I've been teaching about that for a long, long time. And I would be interested in seeing how you did it. Also, he had done this coins workshop, and I had taught that a few times with my own embellishments, because again, there were things that I wanted to make it very accessible. And I had a whole, set of things that I was doing. And then he said, well, let's do it together. And that meant that I would do most of the writing and ask him to input the places that he wanted to write. And I would write about his theories and his exercises. So it was very interesting to write from the perspective of 2 older people who had figured it out, but from 2 totally different cultural perspectives.
And culture has such a big impact on our relationship with money, on our relationship with so many things in our lives, right? And when we kind of see through the course of our lifetime how those early patterns develop and how they stick with us. And so you write about that and how you're able to let it go, right? Using logosynthesis.
Yeah. Early patterning. I mean, certainly in the logosynthesis basic, we know how energy gets stuck.
And you've trained in transactional analysis, and that's a lot about early patterning as well. Can you maybe describe for us a little bit the relationship and the difference between transactional analysis and logosynthesis?
Well, transactional analysis talks about states of the ego states. And logosynthesis is not focusing on the ego. It's focusing on essence, which when Eric Berne originally started talking, he talked about that as well. He said, we have the ego ego states here, and then he drew a shell around it. And he said, out there is the soul. And he didn't talk about that very much. So the emphasis is on ego states. The other thing is that in transactional analysis, there is a branch called redecision therapy, which looks at what is looked at as early script decisions, early decisions about what your life is going to be like. And each of those early decisions is basically freezing energy. It's basically saying, we'll go, this way is blocked because of some overwhelming experience that I don't have the resources to manage, exactly the same as logosynthesis. Mm-hmm. After all, Willem is a transactional analyst as well as many other things. And we have to go this way because we're compelled to, because these things are blocked. And it's about unblocking those decisions to free people to go in whatever direction is now appropriate for them. And so that is completely compatible and overlapping. In transactional analysis, it's always transactional analysis and something, because transactional analysis by itself doesn't deal with that. Those are things that happen in the child ego state.
So it helps to create an awareness of what might have happened, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the block.
The transactional analysis per se, but it's always transactional analysis and Gestalt, redecision transactional analysis, this transactional analysis and developmental psychotherapy, which is what we were experts in, still are. And so it's always transactional analysis and so logosynthesis, I think, fits right in there as what to do once you find out where the blockage is. And it's much easier and less painful than any of those other things, and quicker.
And if I go back to your first book, Letting It Go, you illustrate so beautifully to people how they can find the trigger or the target so that they can identify what the block, and then you guide them through those 3 next steps to show them the way. And so maybe if you could kind of give us a few examples from the book as far as, or just a few examples in our life where this kind of plays an important role.
Well, one of the things that we did when we came back the first time, we were so excited about the process, is that we were telling everybody. And that we set up a whole bunch of introductory courses. One of the things we had taken was, Willem had a class that you could then teach logosynthesis to the public. So we took that and we went ahead with it. And things started happening even before I wrote about them. The first thing that happened was the week after we got back from our original training, we went on a cruise. And on the cruise, people were introducing themselves, and we said, we learned this new tool and we want to practice. And okay, fine. Anybody who's stuck on something, come see us. Okay, because we didn't know. We had very little idea of what we were doing. We wanted to learn. And so the first experience was mind-boggling. We're standing at the rail, waving goodbye, and one woman was hanging back, and I said, come on, there's room. And she said, I don't think so. And I said, well, what's wrong? And it was, well, I'm afraid of falling overboard. Well, on a cruise ship, it hits me about here. So you'd have to climb up on the rail in order to fall overboard. It's not easy. Well, something's wrong. And I said, well, maybe I can do something to help with that. and later in a corner at a cocktail party. Okay, so let's try it, So I do one round with her. She's of the basic sentences. She says, "Oh, my gyroscope is broken." Okay, having no clue about what was going on. And I said, okay. And I did the basic sentences again about the broken gyroscope. I take all my energy out of the broken gyroscope. And then she said, "Oh, and now I can ride escalators too."
Wow. Eh?
So
Wow.
it was like, okay.
And she could then enjoy her cruise, right?
And she could then enjoy her cruise. And about half an hour later, she brought me somebody else. And this woman had been seasick on every boat that she had ever been on in her life. Why she was on this cruise and thought it would be different, I have no idea, but she was seasick. She was taking her medicine. She was doing all her stuff. Will logosynthesis work with seasick? I said, of course it will. I have no idea whether it would work. Long story short, it did. She enjoyed the cruise. It turned out that her trigger was an image of being stuck in her cabin the whole time and missing all the fun.
Wow. Eh?
So it worked with her. And she was thrilled. She was so excited because she even got to go on a small boat without any problem. So I was hooked by then.
I can relate to that because when I first learned it, I was working in a corporate environment. And so all my coworkers, I had to try it out on. And it's like, oh, yeah, this is really intriguing because the little things that get you worked up during the run of the day. And if you can just take the energy out of it and it doesn't work you up anymore, it makes your work life feel a whole lot easier. But as I've learned more, and it's the exact same process as we start to move into issues with trauma, because again, these are blocks, they're frozen perceptions that trigger frozen reactions. And I started to appreciate the importance of that some things are a little bit more complicated than just a quick resolve and we're done with it. And so in your training as a coach and working with people, how do you kind of manage the boundaries between kind of that professional work to make sure that the person who's had, some pretty intense experiences, especially in their childhood, and as they kind of move in, kind of the everyday logosynthesis versus the therapeutic logosynthesis, because it's the same process, it's the same set of sentences, and yet can you kind of talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's being aware of the context. It's being aware that there is much more to people than these little things on the surface, and being aware of what can be triggered. And I've had things triggered because we've done a lot of training of the public.
Mm-hmm.
That first year we did a whole bunch of workshops, and we continued to work in a transformational program where we would do part of the process and introduce people. And so we know what to do with trauma. We've worked with trauma on the deepest levels for, I don't know, 50 years now. Then it was 40. So it never fazed me. And I was aware of the boundaries. But the first time I used logosynthesis in those situations, I found that things progressed so much faster than I had ever expected. I had known to do trauma work slowly and carefully over a long period of time so as not to re-traumatize. And some of the work did re-traumatize, and people wouldn't do it because it was so scary and painful to go back into the situation. And so logosynthesis is a way to not have to go deeply back into the situation, just become aware of it. One of the first experiences I had with that was a young woman, and this is in the book, a young woman, I think she was 17 at the time, was referred because of sexual abuse. And she had been sexually abused by a family member, extended family member, from the time she was 5 till the time she was 12. She had never told anybody about it until recently she started having problems at school. She told her youth minister, who urged her to tell her mother. Her mother brought her to me. And all of the sessions were with her mother present, which was interesting. So in the very first session, I asked her why she hadn't told anybody. And she said that she was afraid that it would destroy the family. And I said, okay. And asked her if she wanted to try something a little strange. And with Mom there, she felt very safe. Sure. So we did it. And in the process, we worked about destroying the family, and she came up with an image of a picture of the family on the wall. And then, something traumatic about it. And then we did the sentences, and the picture dissolved, and she swept it up into the dustbin.
It's interesting, isn't
And
it?
it
Just
was,
how those perceptions shift. But,
it was just stunning.
and then not only does the perception shift, but the feelings, like that intensity that she's experienced, probably shifted as well.
It went away. Another session, like the next session, I think it was 2 sessions. I haven't reviewed the notes for a long time. The next session, did she want to talk about anything specific about the trauma? And she came up with a specific incident. And we worked with that. And again, the picture dissolved and she swept it away. Well, okay. We worked on social issues then with her mother and issues between mother and daughter, things that teenagers do. And then I asked her, did she want to do any more work? And she said, and this was like about 5 sessions later, 5 sessions altogether. I anticipated that this problem would take about 6 months of work. No, nothing's bothering me anymore. And her schoolwork was improving, and the social distancing and the problem with the boyfriend went away. I was like, we're done. We're done.
Wow, eh?
It went away. So,
and I think that's what people, because so often how we're conditioned and how we're trained and what we believe is that we have to learn to live with these things, and we have to learn to cope with these things. And to me, that's what's so beautiful about this work, is that when we can identify and dissolve those energetic triggers, right? It's energy. It's not something in the here and now. It's something in her past. And when we dissolve that, and there's nothing triggering those intense reactions,
the freedom is incredible. And the fact that we could do it with so little trauma for her was the thing that just amazed me. Like I've worked with trauma. I know that trauma can be, is very deep and very pervasive, and that it can be dealt with so much more easily now. And
Yeah,
I
and from my background, not coming from working with trauma, I worked in corporate sales. And so I guess when someone was maybe activated by something that had been traumatic to them, I guess I never really had an appreciation for even what they were experiencing. So you walk into a room and someone gets activated or re-traumatized, and I'm not experiencing it because I'm not taken back to that same place. To me, learning logosynthesis has given me much deeper appreciation for what someone who has experienced trauma actually feels. And, again, if I go back to your books, just showing people how this process works in our everyday life gets us to start to think, okay, now I can see why people respond the way they do when, you know,
Mhm.
in life, right? So, and there's so many people, right? If you think of how many people have had traumatic childhood experiences,
Oh,
there's a lot.
incredible number. I one time in one of our classes, we were working with somebody whose trigger was fear of people laughing at her when she spoke in public. Well, that was pretty direct. We started with that. Except what she got into almost immediately was the trauma of her mother choking her, which she had completely forgotten about.
Wow. And so when she says the fear of speaking in public, and I'm thinking, oh, I get scared speaking in public as well. But my reaction would be, from knowing how people experience these current events that take them right back to that previous event. When I say I have a fear of speaking in public, it's nowhere near what that experience
It's
would
not
be.
connected to that.
Yeah.
And she didn't know it was connected. But we resolved that pretty quickly. And I mean, even when something that traumatic comes up in a public class, we were still able to resolve it.
Wow. Wow. That's interesting, eh? Yeah. And
So,
there's so many stories like that
yeah,
yeah,
I've got
it's
a
getting the
ton.
awareness of. I bet you do.
I've got dozens.
And you don't your husband Jonathan also is a master practitioner and trainer in logosynthesis as well, right? And you've
Mhm.
been a team for many years. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how that relationship kind of enhances the work that you do professionally?
Well, we love to teach together. We've been doing that since 1970. And so it's a really long time. And it's the interesting thing is that I'm trained as an educator, and he was professionally trained long before I was as a therapist. So I would bring uh, the education part. He would bring the professional part, and gradually we kind of merged, and we did group therapy together for 25 years. We sat in the same room with 10 people for 2 hours. We saw about 50 people a week for about 25 years in groups of about 10.
Wow.
So we worked together very, very closely. And the way that we knew that things were okay is if we would have nothing to say to each other afterwards. It's like we trusted each other's work to the sense that he could be working with one thing, I could be working with another. And we just hear the tone and it'd be fine. There were some things teaching long ago. I mean, by the time we were teaching logosynthesis, there was no problem. Very, very smooth. And tell the stories, and move back and forth. And we have a standard practice that if he interrupts me and I lose my train of thought, he has to pick it up and follow it.
And at this point, he probably knows exactly what you're thinking most days, right? That's awesome. So having written the 2 books, what's your goal for these books?
To introduce as many people in the United States to this as possible, because so many things, and there's so much trauma here, there's so much hurt, and it can be dealt with so much more easily than people think. And so I've been on a crusade. I usually start with reduce worry, because I've got a free program on my website that people can pick up and use very easily that introduces them to the logosynthesis sentences after they've learned how to do a trigger, after they've learned how to come out with what triggers their own upset. And then we put it into the sentences, and they don't even know about the sentences when they start. So it's always, long ago, when I started seeing the results of childhood trauma, it was, I wanted to help grown-ups be able to help children. Like an upset adult is what causes the trauma for children. And my goal was to make the world safe for children. And this is part of that work.
It's
It's
such a beautiful goal to have. Yeah.
Just make the world safe.
Yeah, and I often say to people too, like sometimes we're not really aware of how our reactions impact someone else, right? We're going through our busy days and, we've got work, we've got home, we've got, our community that we're engaged in. And, the words we use and the body language and all of that. And as adults, we react. And I think the more that we can be aware of how our reactions impact others and to take ownership for those reactions and to me having logosynthesis as a model that we can use to resolve that and feel calmer in our everyday life, it does benefit.
Such different backgrounds, Cathy.
I know, but they all come together, right? It's a very similar goal.
Yeah, our goals are very similar, but our backgrounds, I learned that as a teacher when I was like 22 years old. And then it just kept, then as a therapist, I kept learning more and more and more about it.
Yeah, I think our backgrounds are really different, but to me, that's what makes it so interesting with the logosynthesis, because it's so universal for everyone, right? And one of the things that I noticed when it started coming up as far as my reactions and taking ownership of my reactions, it ended up getting into these beliefs. So I was reacting because I believed that things had to be a certain way. And when they weren't a certain way, right? When they weren't a certain way, the other person was wrong and they had to do it differently and things had to be fixed and changed. And what was really interesting for me is I think if it had been anyone other than Willem that was challenging me to the level that I was being challenged about how I was reacting, I probably would have walked away. And there was just something there with the way that he held the space to say, when I was angry at what was going on at work, he would say, well, if you're angry, that's your work to do. Like, no, that's the organization. And, I've got to make some changes there. And he's like, no, it's your response to that. that's the issue. And when you change your response, right? When I resolved those triggers and I was calm, I was much better able to have a conversation that you could maybe, facilitate some change. But when I was in that agitated state, I'll call it agitated, when I was reacting, then I believed that that's what I had to do, right?
Well,
Do you come across that?
watching you develop over the years has been just fun because you came in so totally naive and learned so much, and you kept putting yourself into the situation over and over and over again. And I'm going to learn this. I'm going to master this. I'm going to manage it.
Yeah. Yeah, but there was a lot of energy stuck in that, right? Like there was a lot of energy in
It was determination from my point of view.
stubbornness, determination. But from where I sit now, I can feel calmer about it. And I guess a little bit my point is when I was back at that initial stage, I didn't necessarily see it from the perspective that I see it now. And so, I think I'm not necessarily the only one in that situation, right? I think we can all benefit from raising our awareness, and a piece is for our own peace of mind and our own well-being, and another piece is for those around us.
I think, Cathy, that most people believe that what they're doing is something that they have to do because that is what allowed them to thrive or even survive in their own families as small children, in school, in the work situation. And they have developed a set of things. And it's like, don't step on the cracks. You'll break your mother's back, that thing. And well, I haven't stepped on the cracks and my mother's back is still fine. So I better keep doing it because it's working. And so people are very attached to the things that they have learned to do, whether those things really feel good or not. They at least allow the level of functioning that I've got now.
Yeah, and I think where they are attached in beliefs, and Willem's got a new course coming up on that soon, or a new book, I think, on the way as well. But when we're talking about beliefs, those are frozen energy structures as well, right? And they do help us
Absolutely.
make sense of the world. But especially in a changing world, they can get in the way. And so being able to kind of just free the energy that's stuck there so that we can be more in flow in our everyday life does feel better.
Makes a huge difference.
So what message do you have for people, like as a final message?
Keep on learning. Just keep on. That's the thing that Jonathan and I decided many, many years ago as a couple, that what we would do is support each other's growth. No matter how scary it was, no matter how painful it was, we would be there to support each other's growth. I think that's the greatest gift that we can give to ourselves and to each other, to just be open to learning.
And sharing your learning is awesome because we all benefit from that. So thank you. Thank you so much, Laurie. I certainly appreciate you sharing your expertise, your insights, and for inspiring so many of us. So thank you so much.
Oh, you are so welcome. This was such fun.